Welcome to this session on language policy and memory. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Wendy Ayres-Bennett. I'm Professor of French Philology and Linguistics at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also PI on one of the other ARI projects, MITES, Multilingualism, Empowering Individuals, Transforming Societies. I'm very interested in language policy. I'm an author of a report, The Value of Languages, which came out in 2016 in conjunction with the Cambridge Strategic Research Initiative on Public Policy, and MITES, alongside many of the other ARI programs, has a strong policy dimension, and we have a new online policy journal, Languages, Society and Policy. There are some flyers around. This is shameless self-promotion. There are some flyers around if anybody would like to find out more about it. We're very fortunate to have two excellent speakers this morning. Terry Lamb is Professor of Languages and Interdisciplinary Pedagogy at the University of Westminster, and he's also head of the Westminster Centre for Teaching Innovation. Both our speakers are particularly well qualified to talk about language policy. Terry has spent 16 years teaching languages in secondary schools. I notice alongside the usual suspects, French, German, Spanish, there's Turkish, interestingly, among the mix. But he's also done a lot of consultancy work for the Ministry of Education in Malaysia, the Ministry of Youth, Education and Sport in the Czech Republic. He's a member of the Multilingualism Expert Group of the European Civil Society Platform for Multilingualism, and in the UK he's served as President of the Association for Language Learning. He was a member of the government's National Language Steering Group and a governor of CILT, the National Centre for Languages. In 2008 he was appointed chair of the Languages Diploma Development Partnership by the then Secretary of State and now dancer Ed Balls. He's also former President and current Secretary General of FIPLV, the Fédération Internationale des Professeurs des Langues Vivantes, which enjoys NGO status with both UNESCO and the Council of Europe. Finally, and not last but not least, he's chair, I believe, of the Advisory Board of Language Acts and World Making Project. And then next to me I have Lyd King, who has similarly spent a number of years as a language teacher in secondary higher and adult education, A-level examiner, materials writer, before becoming director of CILT from 1992 to 2003. From 2003 until 2011, he was National Director for Languages. I think Languages Czar is the title that I sometimes
the
hear
unofficial title,
attached to you.
Taking the head's chopped off.
Yeah, I like Languages Czar. Taking forward the implementation of the National Languages Strategy for England. Yes, we did have one. In 2008, he set up the Languages Company to work with a range of partners to help deliver this strategy. And following the, very regrettable decision in 2010 of the coalition government not to continue with the languages strategy, and then in the following year, the end of most of the targeting funding for languages in schools, the Languages Company is now working to promote better pedagogy and also to try and move things forward on language policy in England and indeed more widely. Lyd was the first recipient of the David Crystal Trophy for his outstanding contribution to the field of languages in November 2016, and he likewise has been an advisor on a number of international boards, including the European Union and the Council of Europe. So I understand from Catherine that the idea from this panel came from a comment by Terry at one of the advisory board meetings. There's a lack of languages memory about language policy in the UK. So this panel is based on an attempt to try and make sure that we are retrieving and building on the language policies over the last 40 years. As many of you will know, there's been a whole series of policies coming from bodies like the British Council, the British Academy, as well as from government about modern languages, and yet we know that modern languages are not in a good state in the UK currently. This discussion is going to build very much on our two speakers' personal experiences of creating and enacting language policy, their memories of language policy, And we're going to talk about what has gone right, and I think also what has gone wrong in the past, and then perhaps move on to thinking about how we can build on that and take forward some ideas for future language policy. So Terry and Lyd have been asked to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes to start with. We'll then have a discussion, three of us, for a short while, before I'll open up to comments and questions and a proper discussion, I hope. Just to say to you that we're intending to observe the minute silence at 12 o'clock for the Grenfell tragedy. So we will just pause at that point, and we will close around 12:30 because one of the speakers needs to get away for another engagement. So that's the programme. Okay, so we won't hear any more from me. We'll move straight on to Terry to start the ball rolling.
Thank you,
Terry.
Wendy. Thanks. Thank you. Well, thanks for coming along. I've just noticed there's a whole set of people over this shoulder as well.
Left field.
Left field, you say no. So we want this to be fairly informal. We don't have formal PowerPoint presentations. We're being innovative. Yeah? No PowerPoint presentations. This is about memories and reflections. So as Wendy says, I mean, I'm going to give you a fairly personal and therefore quite subjective picture, but one that has been informed in a way by my own insider perspective of engagement with policy and the ways in which I've worked in a number of ways on language policy. So I'm going to give you, as I say, a fairly broad sweep, looking at the situation decade by decade, the 80s, 90s and noughties. After that, I'm going to stop because then I'll be asking you to tell me what language policy is. No, since 2010. But that is the kind of history that I'm particularly interested in. I must say that, and Wendy's just referred to it as well, when Catherine mentioned the 40-year period, I was outraged at first, and I've said this to Catherine, 40 years, how old do you think I am? And then I realised that it's 40 years this year since I started my PGCE. So, yeah. I hadn't realised that I'd been around so long. Okay, so, but what is very interesting about that, when I thought about that, was that, yeah, so that was 1978. And a couple of the things that were happening then, in that decade, have actually informed my work ever since. So, and they were really related to inclusion, even though I don't think they were called inclusion in those days. I mean, one was the Warnock report, so the integration of children with special educational needs. I should say also that I'm coming at this very much from a school's perspective, although you know, we can move on to something around higher education as well. But I think given that it seemed the schools are key to us having students in higher education, that's where I'm coming from. So there was the Warnock report, and very interesting when we go to the all-party parliamentary group to see Baroness Warnock still there and turning up, which is wonderful. It's living history for me. And the other thing was I wrote my final bigger piece of work on multicultural education when I finished in 1979. So there was that kind of commitment to inclusion, to everyone learning a language and to valuing difference, multicultural education and social justice really have stuck with me ever since. The 3 decades I want to give a very brief overview of, because you can always come back to things in more detail, were really quite different from one another. So the 1980s, I'll start by just saying where I was. I mean, I was teaching in London throughout the 80s. I came straight to London from my PGCE, so and I taught in 4 different schools, all of them inner city, diverse schools, increasingly multilingual as the 80s progressed, ending up with a school in North London where there were 40 languages. Nowadays that's nothing, but it was, you know, if we're talking about the late 80s, there were 40 languages in that school. And also in the early 80s, I did my MA in urban education here at King's. So I thought that was worth mentioning because I'm back here at King's, and my dissertation was on multilingual education and multilingualism and policy. So I looked at policy in the Inner London Education Authority, national policy, and also European Union in particular policy. And I look back to that decade really very fondly. It was a very creative decade. Of course, it was all pre the 1988 Education Reform Act. And for those of you who are not quite clear about that act, I mean, it was a very, very significant one because, first of all, it introduced a national curriculum. We didn't have a national curriculum before that. And it also was a kind of sign of democratization of education. Local management of schools meant that schools were taking greater responsibility for their own management. That league tables were introduced, Ofsted was introduced, sort of inspection regime there. The idea of parental choice, though it was never quite the case, was introduced in that. But that was 1988, and of course it took till the 90s before that got going. So the 80s it was a period of great curriculum flexibility. We used to have local inspections. We would have ILEA inspections in the London, but they were supportive, they were thorough, supportive, formative dialogues, really, that helped us to develop the quality. There was a huge amount of collaboration across schools. We worked in consortia. The Inner London Education Authority was divided into divisions, and we worked together on curriculum development that was appropriate and relevant in our particular contexts. We shared sixth forms and A-levels so that we could offer A-levels because there weren't huge groups even in the early 80s. And generally kind of approaches to learning and teaching. There was flexibility in the sense that we had, of course, we had O-levels and CSEs, and we had Mode 3 CSEs, which schools could develop and get accredited, so schools could collaborate and develop some new way of accrediting. And, you know, major themes in that decade, just to finish that decade, really there's a focus on differentiation a lot. I mean, I started my work in learner autonomy, really, in the 80s through developing flexible learning. Graded objectives were there. We were able to support children to feel the progress, to be motivated by the progress they were making. There were vocational courses as well as the academic courses. And then in terms of other forms of inclusion, a lot of work on multicultural and anti-racist education, very much a focus on social justice. This is why the ILEA was shut down, really, and most of the power was taken away from local authorities because they were seen as being too outrageous and wasting time on things like social justice. So they were disbanded. Language awareness. I mean, I was very fortunate that my PGCE tutor and then my MA supervisor was a very close friend and colleague of Eric Hawkins. So I did a lot of work on language awareness work in those years. And we were able to develop curricula in schools that we felt was appropriate. We did language tasters in my last school, French, German, Greek and Turkish. It was in North London. We did language awareness in personal, social and health education. So with other teachers, not just language teachers doing it. Children had a choice of which language they were going to do as their first language, first foreign language. And of course they weren't all foreign languages because many monolingual English speakers chose to do Turkish or Greek in that school because it made sense to them. They could use it straight away with their friends, and very often then chose to do a second foreign language. So it worked in terms of motivation. So there was a very kind of motivational time, very flexible and creative decade. The 1990s saw me moving back up to Sheffield, but getting a job in a very small town in the middle of Derbyshire, which was a bit of a contrast, very monolingual. Partway through that decade, I moved to the University of Nottingham to work on the PGCE course, and I started to work locally and then nationally with ALL, the Association for Language Learning. And what I can remember of that decade in schools was just our struggle to introduce the national curriculum, which seemed to lead us to a preoccupation with measuring, identifying, labelling, finding evidence. We used to have big discussions about how many pieces of evidence do we need to collect to show that a child is on level 2, and where do we keep them, where do we store them, all of those things. And we would have meetings galore, and there'd be, you know, local authority meetings where we would discuss those things over and over again. So there was a lot of time that we could have been doing something that was much more creative, spent sort of trying to make sure that what we were doing was right, because of course Ofsted now existed, and if they came when you weren't doing it right, then, you know, the threat was you'd be closed down. So the league tables meant there was competition between schools. My school didn't want to work with other schools and give our ideas away. So, you know, that was, we were in competition, yeah. So the creativity was stifled very much from my perspective as a head of languages. Although I must say that I continued to develop the flexible learning at a time when people were kind of nervous about Ofsted and tended to kind of go back to a much more traditional approach. And I developed the flexible learning because there was nothing actually in the curriculum that stopped you being creative at all. It was a perception that we are being inspected, we need to do things properly, we need to have evidence and all of that, that stopped a lot of people, you know, a lot of the work that had happened in the 80s stopped. I continued and just made a case, and it was praised by inspectors. So, you know, sometimes it is a perception of policy that is the issue. I also found that schools were no longer focused on anything that didn't count in the league tables. So there was no work on the multicultural, anti-racist work, for example, and other kinds of cross-curricular work because it just didn't count in league tables. And Ofsted weren't interested in those days on that either. And it sort of showed up when I moved to Nottingham University, because then I was, for the first time, in higher education, and wanting to go back to my work on multilingual education, and fearing that because I'd been out of this context in a very monolingual place for 6 years, I must have got really left behind. And of course I found out that nothing had happened in the meantime, because people were too busy deciding how many pieces of evidence they needed to label a child as level 2 or 3, and what the difference was. So, so that then, for me, you can see there's the up of the 80s, that fairly down in my experience of the 90s, and then 2000 came, by which time I moved to Sheffield University. I became the president of the Association for Language Learning in 2001. I became a governor of SILT. Lyd and I started, I mean, I'd been to SILT before, but this is where we started to work much more closely, and my involvement later in the decade with the International Federation of Language Teacher Associations, and continuing my research and stuff in learner autonomy and multilingualism. So in 2000 we saw the Nuffield report. The Nuffield report, I won't say any more because we can always come back to any of these things, but the Nuffield report was a wide-reaching a report conducted with a lot of consultation, a lot of input, and presented very publicly. And in response, the government, which by then was the Labour government from 1997, set up the National Languages Steering Group with the view of enacting some of the recommendations from the Nuffield report. I think the first time we met we were too ambitious, and it was kind of slightly reorganised a bit because there was a realisation that the country couldn't afford everything that we wanted. So it was slightly controlled a bit, but the National Languages Steering Group, where I represented ALL, Lyd was on there, obviously, representing SILT, and many others. It was a great time for bringing people together that didn't normally meet up quite so easily, and a real attempt as well to bring in people from other ministries. We would have people to try and make the case that this is not just about education, it's actually other. That had mixed success, I must say. So the National Languages Strategy was developed and launched in 2002. Just a few points about that. It made a case for valorising linguistic diversity. The statements were in there, and the funded work that came out of that really was about building on our linguistic capital, our national linguistic diversity, saying that it had been treated with suspicion for too long, and that we needed to build on it rather than ignore it or be scared by it. And it also was informed by the twin government pillars of social inclusion and community cohesion. So the arguments around linguistic diversity supported those. We had, we shifted from this label of modern foreign languages, or modern languages, to languages. In the 80s, in the London Education Authority, we were heads of languages, we weren't heads of modern languages. We were because our departments included not only the community languages, but also English as an additional language, which I think was still called second language in those days, and sometimes even the English department. So it was really trying to work across language departments. We're developing an inclusive curriculum with a balance between academic and vocational, and valuing vocational as a way of encouraging more to stay on school beyond the age of 16. The languages ladder was developed, and that of course led to asset languages, which gave accreditation for the first time to many languages. There were over 20 languages, I think, in the end. The primary languages were to be introduced by 2010. So there was a proper strategy to do that, and SILT obviously did a huge amount of work to build the upskill the teachers to develop different ways of actually enabling primary languages to happen, and working a lot on transition between primary and secondary. Huge amount of work, including research. I mean, there was a lot of research going on to inform things in those years. Some various models were developed to do that, and certainly by 2010, most people were kind of on, I think most schools were well on target and doing things that were substantial. Yeah. We had, SILT became the National Centre for Languages, because there was an argument that we needed something that would promote languages. The languages are, here he is. So Lyd became National Director for Languages. And with that were significant initiatives with funding. I mean, the Our Languages project was one which brought together mainstream schools with supplementary schools, and they did some great work collaborating, because until then they'd been completely separate. We had the World Languages Strategy, which I was involved in. That was a £500,000 research project to develop a strategy for government that would enable schools to offer a wider range of languages, and to make sure that there was qualified teacher routes for a wider range of languages. And also, of course, the 14 to 19 diploma in languages and international communication that I led, which where we were really encouraged to develop a curriculum that would motivate children to continue to do languages. And huge amount of research went into that, and consultation, and higher education was very, very happy, I think, generally with the outcomes of that. Other things happened which I won't go into. A number of frameworks, languages frameworks, curriculum frameworks, and pedagogical frameworks. The downside of that decade was that languages became an entitlement, which was misinterpreted as optional, and schools immediately jumped the gun. And remember the headline on the front page of the Times Educational Supplement, which was about my old school. So that's I told them because I'd found out about what had happened in this school where I'd actually done my PhD research as well. But even that, and I won't go into it now, maybe we'll come back to it, but I mean, I at some point I'd like to explain why that happened in the way that it did, and that actually it was part of a strategy, because the idea was that there would be compulsory languages from 9 to 14, which was a kind of properly developed curriculum. And from 14, there would be a range of different kinds of qualifications. So they talked about the push and the pull. Yeah. So the push would mean that by the age of 14, children were able to operate in a language having had more compulsory years, and therefore be able to talk about things that were more relevant to their age group at 14, because one of the problems was at 14 they couldn't, and they found it boring. And then we'd have these range of different qualifications that would pull them into continuing to study. And I think that really is about it, because in 2010, of course, there was no more national languages strategy. It kind of fizzled, didn't it? We never actually had an announcement. And
well, it had a year. It survived a year because all the money was in place, but nobody was interested in it. So
yeah.
I notionally had some meetings with ministers who just said, "Oh, thank you very much," and that was it.
Yeah. Same with the primary languages. Yeah, and all of the things. The World Languages Strategy project was halfway through, and I had a letter from the government saying world languages are no longer a priority of government. We'd like you to work on French, German, Spanish, possibly Mandarin, but with a focus on looking at how teacher education can be shifted more into schools, which for someone that was involved in initial teacher education, was a bit odd. And of course, the diploma, which by that time had just been, had just gone through Ofqual, and it was there, and we had 40 primary consortia of schools with wonderful ideas to take forward the first year as a pilot, was just cancelled. It was very interesting that, and this is where the memory comes in, because I've just had numerous experiences of an amnesia around it all. So, because the Labour Party and Tony Blair and the whole Iraq thing, I think has affected what was acceptable from the Labour government. So I can remember writing a few years later when the Conservatives or the coalition had decided to introduce primary very quickly, and were being praised by people as being really supportive of languages because they're introducing primary. And I wrote to my local MP and said, what is the Labour Party's policy on multilingualism? And he said, well, we don't really have one on languages. He said, don't think we have one, but I can say that I'm very supportive of the Conservative Party for introducing primary languages. I think this is really good. And I wrote back to him and said, please, I don't want to hear that from a Labour MP. Don't you know what happened in that period, and we would have had it already. He never responded. So there was this kind of amnesia about it, and that we had a national languages strategy that was thought through and funded, So I examined a PhD a few weeks ago that was looking at policy, and of course the government strategy now of the EBAC being the driver it's causing some schools a real problem, because what it means is doing the GCSE, and they're saying, but we need other kinds of qualifications as well. But there isn't anything else that counts. So, you know, but I mean, otherwise, in terms of a policy since 2010, it's not been terribly clear to me. But just my final sentence is that one of the benefits of having been around for 40 years, getting older, is that having seen the ups of the 80s, the downs of the 90s, the ups of the noughties and the downs now, you know that at some point there'll be an up again. So you kind of have to be optimistic,
Relatively.
I think. Something will happen.
Thank you very much, Terry. There's lots of themes I think we're going to be able to pick up from that. I'm conscious of how many of the things that you talked about in relation to the National Languages Strategy are things which are still very much troubling us today. The need to upskill primary school teachers, really big problem. The problem of our transitions. I'm thinking about the Ofsted report, you know, Key Stage 3, the wasted years, modern languages, the worst of everything in that. The need to have more cooperation between supplementary schools and main schools, and the need to think about languages across government. These are all burning issues still today. And so we'll come back to them perhaps and explore how we can learn from some of these experiences in taking things forward. But perhaps now turn to Lyd, who's going to tell us about specific policies, I think.
Nothing, well, sort of. Thanks very much. Just thinking, listening to Terry, I kind of agree with his up and down thing, except I think the 90s are actually better than you say. The 90s introduced the national curriculum in languages for the very first time, for example, and languages for all until the age of 16. So there were things going on in the 90s. But where I do agree is that what we lost in between the 80s and the 90s was the bottom-up approach. You didn't mention graded objectives, I don't think, but teachers working together. And one of the reasons for that, and one of the key issues that you might want to think about later, is, and the Labour government introduced it and it's just got worse, or they promoted a lot, is the accountability curriculum, which I think has been disastrous for the whole curriculum. I think it's a totally non-educational, and for languages it has been about the worst of all. And people being frightened of Ofsted and keeping things in cupboards to prove something that's probably not worth proving is a very good example of that. One thing that Terry didn't mention before I say what I was going to say, one of the big influences through that period, and that's ironic as well, one of a mainly positive influence has been Europe. And right from the post-war period, the Council of Europe, and from a slightly later date, the European Union has significantly influenced attitudes towards language, the importance of multilingualism, ideas about language, language as an asset, etc., etc., etc. And that has influenced us, at least until recent years. What I wanted to mention, though, really was something a bit broader, but I'll try and weave into it some of the specifics and not keep you too long, because you must have lots of things you want to talk about now. When we did some work, I was still National Director, but sort of semi-detached, and we did a European project, the outcome of which was this little pamphlet, Languages in Europe Towards 2020, which really analysed language policy and theory and practice in Europe and in individual countries. And one of the reflective parts of it doesn't purport to be a great theoretical work, but there is some theoretical input, is to actually ask the question, and I think it's worth doing if we're talking about policy, what is policy? How do you define a policy, particularly in relation to education? And there are three broad issues, it seemed to us, and that's set out in there in some rather more detail. There's explicit and implicit policy. Now, the conventional view of a policy, and what we think of if we think of a policy probably, is that there's some kind of formal process and governments ask people to do a report, they look at the current situation, they set some targets, then they work out an implementation plan and say that's how we're going to do it, and it will be something like we're going to increase the number of people studying German in the next 5 years by 20%, and in order to do that we need to recruit blah 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 blah, etc. You can see that sounds like a policy, doesn't it? That's very traditional, and that in a sense is what the national strategy was trying to do, although as somebody involved in it I think it wasn't as coherent as it might have been, but it was at least an attempt to do. But actually, one of the things that Joe LoBianco has said, I'm sure, well, Terry knows him, I know, and many of you will have heard of him. He's a very interesting Australian person involved in language policy and has been for many years, developed the Australian national policy, for example, back in the 80s. In fact, he's so long in the tooth, he now criticises his own policy because things have moved on. But as he points out, very few policies actually work in that way. There are other factors that come into play. Language choices by individuals, by groups, by societies. Taking an example that Terry just mentioned, the whole question of post-14 languages. There was a policy that says it's compulsory, which was introduced in 1996 for full implementation a year later, and was cancelled in 2004, and everybody threw their hands up and said that's terrible. But the fact was the policy wasn't working, it wasn't happening. So although there was a policy, it didn't happen. It happened for some people, and it was better to have it than not, but the number of people not carrying through that policy was significant. That's a good example of how choice actually determines policy. So policymakers actually have to take account of reality as well as having a great idea of what they're going to do. And actually across Europe, I see that because we've done a number of reports and investigation in Europe, there is a much better policy than practice in most cases. For example, many countries will say all of our students reach level B2 at the end of compulsory education. The fact is they don't. In France, very few people reach even A2 at the end of compulsory education from any objective evidence that we can see. But the policy is that they do, as though saying that it will happen makes it happen. There's also non-policy policy. That's an interesting concept. I don't know, we can't pin down the original for the quotation. There's no such thing as policy. If you don't have a policy, it's a policy to do nothing. It's either supposed to be Mao Zedong or Milton Friedman, which is quite interesting. It's like, maybe it was both. And David Little gave us an example from Ireland, gave us an example from Ireland. In Ireland, there is no policy. They're very proud of not having a policy. But the result of that, for example, if you don't have a policy on primary languages, then your policy is not to teach primary languages. So policy is a negative as well. And then there are areas where it's so obvious you don't have a policy. We don't have a policy, I don't think, maybe there is now, that English will be the language of schooling in England, because it just is. Some countries specify what, in Armenia, you specify that Armenian must be the language of schooling and you can't use any other language, for example. A broader question is, and this is one that Terry also touched on, language. What's language? So what's policy is one thing. What's language? Do we have a policy or policies? And generally speaking, up until 2007, I would say we had policies. So we had a policy for what were called foreign languages. We have a policy for English. We had a policy for community languages. We had a policy for adult, or attempts to a policy in the terms I've defined it. But what do we need? We need a coherent language policy that can run across a school. Lots of schools attempted to do that, languages across the curriculum, and there's been discussion on going on that right back until Bullock's time and earlier. We nearly got there. This is the thing that frustrates me most about everything that's happened. Terry mentioned primary languages. It was even more catastrophic than he says. The work that was done on primary languages, which involved enormous amounts of resource, enormous amounts of training, lots of goodwill from some brilliant teachers right across the country, and advisors and people working with them, some of them are still carrying on, of course, had resulted in the development of a new primary curriculum. And the new primary curriculum, for the whole curriculum, not just languages, but language was there as English languages and communication. That was a curricular area that was brought together with a lot of complicated and hard work, and it was published. I nearly brought it but it's so heavy. I had enough stuff to bring. It's published, and it went through QCA, as was and no longer is, and was sent to schools for implementation. Guess what? In 2010. And it got caught in the wash-up, as they call it. The opposition parties refused to accept it, even though it had been through its first and second readings in Parliament, and got thrown away. And then we started again and say, oh, let's do primary languages, but not that one. We're going to do Latin, Greek, and French primary languages. Anyway, so that was an attempt to bring together. And there are countries that do this. There are jurisdictions that do this. Catalonia is a very case in point, where they develop a policy which is about Spanish and Catalan and English and other foreign languages and the languages of immigration coming into their country. And schools have to develop a school policy in order to reflect that. But that is rare. I mean, generally speaking, we have this divergence of policy, and that's an area that needs to be. The other big area, I think, that we have to take into account is that language policy never exists in isolation. It's part of broader policy issues. And that was quite easy to work out in my time, because the Labour Party did have a strategy about education. The government had and they had priorities. You knew what they were. All governments have raising standards as a priority. Most governments have economic success, entrepreneurship. They also had things like citizenship and social cohesion. That you can feed all of that in. I used to show a slide, put a slide up there showing what are the drivers, what are the policy drivers that the government has, and out of that you can say, well, where does language fit in? Because if it doesn't fit into that, we can talk anything we like and have all kinds of imaginary dreams, but they won't happen. The problem is now that list of drivers is pretty restricted, I think, as far as education is concerned. Maybe you know better. So in broad terms then, what's determined policy in England? Well, until the strategy, I don't think there was this kind of explicit strategy. There was, as Terry has said, that idea developed in the 90s. And there was a lot of talk about strategies even before Nuffield, and it brought it all together, and we said we need a strategy, we need a policy, and that went through into the National Language Strategy and so on. Before that, and there's a book by Nicola McClellan, whose title I've forgotten, published last year. It's one of those terribly expensive Routledge books, so you can just read little bits online. I think it costs £100 or something like that. She quotes over 100 major reports, official statements, proposals on languages or language policy over the last century. And if you get hold of this book, 30 Years of Language Teaching, edited by Eric Hawkins, which we published in SILT in 1996. So some of you, that seems an age ago, I know, but that was going from 1966 to 1966 was when SILT was established by the Conservative government. Well, on the proposal of the Conservative government, the Labour had come in by the time it actually got going, and it was maintained by the Conservative government in order to disseminate information about language teaching and research, and then later on to promote languages. If you get hold of that, in the back of that there's a very interesting list of all different reports. There were reports on Russian, the Annan report on Russian, there were all kinds of developments going on through that period, but also before. Recommendations for improving language competency. Interestingly, that I see one of the earlier talks, I don't know if you went to, was about the Leiths report from 1917, which was quite significant. Then there was the work of SILT and the HMI in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't Ofsted, it was HMI who had a big role in looking at what was going on in school, making reports, disseminating good practice. They produced some very substantial publications at that time. 27 Schools, I think, was the name of one of them. So the issue with all of those reports, however, as always, it's not as simple as it seems, because they all...
It's going to break into a dance now.
Yeah. This happened to me once when I was talking to teachers, and I just said something very critical of the government when I was National Director, and I said, "Oh, that's probably Mr. Gove on the phone." That wasn't Mr. Gove. Yeah, so but the problem, one of the other issues that we have to grapple with is that all of these reports deal with different things and have different solutions. So one of the leitmotifs going through all of them is promoting languages, the importance of promoting languages. People don't get how important it is. We've got to have a campaign, and that's what Lise was saying back there. There's also stuff about teacher support. Well, the way to improve languages is to support teachers better and to give them training, and that's what SILT was doing, and the precursor, the Committee for Modern for Research in Development in Modern Languages, which sort of segued into SILT. Dissemination of good practice, that's what HMI was doing, and that's an argument. Curriculum design. After the national curriculum, we had this wonderful thing called Mufflewug. You know, who knows what Mufflewug is? Modern Foreign Languages Working Group, chaired by Martin Harris, and they came up with one of the first descriptions of what a languages curriculum should look like. We have a lot of talk about how language is linked to society. That's a lot of what Nuffield was about, is also what the languages strategy was about. And more recently, perhaps, there have been more of a concentration on pedagogy and what good pedagogy is. So out of all of those, which bits do you turn into a policy? It's not coherent or consistent yet. In practice, this gets back to the point I made right at the beginning, what affects what people do, and I think the problem has been steadily, step by step, compared with the days when I was at school, when I know people always say this kind of thing, and it was a grammar school, and so maybe that's different, but I don't think it is, where as far as I could see, the teachers had no objectives, no curricula as such, they just knew where they wanted us to get to, and we had a rather nice time. And we all remember teachers who would go off on and they were teaching us, actually. So I don't recommend that to teach trainers as a method. But the point is that people can learn without all of this, and that all of this, I think, has stifled the creativity of teachers. The accountability regime has been too heavy. And interestingly, I was at a conference a couple of years ago where Estelle Morris made a mea culpa for this, said we wanted to raise standards, but we went about it the wrong way, we went too far. And we have too many standards to do so. Other things that have influenced policy or what people do have been external factors. For example, one of the reasons in Ireland that a lot of people do languages is that it remains a criterion for university entrance. That stopped here in 1966, apart from, I think, Oxford and Cambridge, when SILT was set up.
UCL's brought it back.
Yeah, but in a sort of way.
Yeah.
Not as it was. And now the main thing, it seems to me, that is attempting to implement change, because the policy has no implementation policy for what it wants to do, are exams, targets, and even, as Terry said, the EBAC, which is causing difficulty and is incompatible with another policy they've got, which is called Progress 8. Which one's the most important? We don't know. Does that have to be the case? Well, that's perhaps what we've got to discuss. And I shall shut up.
Thank you very much. Again, big questions coming out of that, and I think one of the very interesting things is whether the policy just to have promoting languages as a policy is the right thing, or whether we should be speaking more to these big agendas, you know, the questions of social cohesion, the questions of immigration, soft power diplomacy, international trade, L1 literacy. I mean, there's research coming through now saying how good foreign language learning is for L1 literacy. That's a big button to press, which we're not really pressing very hard at the moment. So perhaps we can think about some of those issues. But just to start off, and we'll perhaps have a conversation until 12 amongst ourselves, have a minute's silence, and then we'll open it up. You've mentioned all these policies, you've picked out a few of them. If there was one that you would like to bring back out of our collective memory and resuscitate and try and give back to government, as it were, what would that be, and what was the strengths of it?
Undoubtedly, the primary primary languages as they were. Well, I can't do one. I'd have to do two. primary languages as they were, because that actually was I say that immodestly because I was quite involved in it, but I wasn't alone. Nobody's ever alone in all this. There were a lot of people thinking that through. For example, we developed a framework which involved many hours and many people and enormous amount of trialling to provide a framework of what happens. And the framework for primary languages, again, it's such a big document I couldn't have brought it with me, but you can still find it if you look really carefully in the archive somewhere, described a curriculum which was about communicative competence, of course, but it was also linking to the ways that English was being taught, because we work with the English people, people work on the English strategy. It was talking about oracy, it was talking about intercultural comprehension, it was talking about knowledge about language in primary from 7. And actually with some indications of things that might happen before 7, because the compulsion was only from 7. So that's just one example of an enormous bank of stuff which was produced and was working. That's the frustrating thing. It wasn't that it was only half successful, it was being very successful. And now I have been into primary schools in recent years for different reasons. I won't say I tear my hair out, but I'm sad.
I think
Because it's like it was before it started.
I mean, the language trends surveys tell us that something like, 27 or so % of teachers have little or no knowledge of the language, and that's certainly what we're finding with the research my group is doing in primary schooling, that we're working with a school where the school decided to teach French. Nobody in the school, none of the primary school teachers knew French. There was one person who knew GCSE German, but they thought that despite that it would be good to teach French. And it's no wonder that the teachers feel panicked by having to teach something where they have little or no competence. And so it's a recipe for failure.
And that has always been an issue and a problem of which language in primary, if you give choice, apparent choice, but also policy can push people into that kind of direction. And if you say we want them to get to a level, and it's all about getting to levels through primary to secondary, there will be a tendency to push everybody into French, because more secondaries are doing French. Spanish might come in. It's disastrous for German, that kind of policy. The other thing I was going to say, and I'm sure Terry would agree with that, is the assessment. I mean, the assessment now is awful, sorry. And yet we had the languages ladder and the diploma between them were innovatory. I mean, the languages ladder was perhaps slightly crude, and a perfection idealist would say, oh, you could do it better, but we've never had anything like it. Nobody has ever had anything like it. And funding was taken away, and that's the end of that. And it was not promoted enough to be carried through. The diploma, I think, was fantastic as a concept, and it dealt with one of the issues to do with assessment, regardless of whether it's good or a bad assessment, is, and this is a general issue in the English education system, probably the Scottish one as well, if you work in those broad levels of level 1, level 2 and level 3, as we understand them, you can relate those to a common European framework as well. In the British system, by and large, in order to achieve level 1, you have to fail level 2. Well, that actually is not an achievement. But, I mean, Mike Tomlinson pointed this out when he was trying to develop general diplomas many years ago. Just think about it. If you were offered the opportunity to achieve a level 1 qualification, which means that you have a very basic communicative competence, but you could get by on basic communication, reading, probably not much writing, but reading and speaking in Chinese, would you not be pleased? But that's not on offer. And for many pupils, one of the things in the Deering Review, as it's called, that we were moving towards saying, well, we could use the languages ladder in a really interesting way, because they could maybe get a level in French and a level in German and put them together, and that could be an equivalent of a GCSE. The diploma had tasks to do and an achievement to reach, which was worth having. It wasn't a failure at level 1.
No.
That's right.
No.
And so that you could carry through a thought out concept of what language learning was about and how it related to international communication as appropriate for those 3 different levels, not where you do some rubbish thing for level 1 and then you can do the interesting stuff later on.
Yeah.
Well, part of
Yeah.
the problem is pupils find it very difficult to imagine what doing languages at an interesting way could possibly be, given the kind of things they do in the low level of schooling,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
that's a real problem. The creativity and the interest, and
Yes.
what could you possibly do at university?
Yeah.
Terry,
Yes.
in a couple of minutes, could you perhaps
Um,
answer that same question? What
Well,
would you
I
want
mean, I would
bring
agree
back?
with Lyd. I mean, it's hard to choose
Disagree?
one.
Yeah.
But I would certainly agree with Lyd, but for the same reasons about the assessment. But I think I would come at it from also the angle that it valued multilingualism. So I think anything which sees the multilingualism that we have as an asset rather than as a problem, and certainly the diploma did that, and asset languages
Did, yeah.
provided ways of actually accrediting it. I think that was another significant area for that. And even though I didn't mention it, I think the Languages for All was also very important. And I was the head of department, of course, when that was introduced, and it was a struggle because teachers weren't that used to teaching the whole range. But it did shift the mindset to the idea that everyone can do languages. It wasn't implemented terribly well at the time. People were sort of struggling because they were still trying to work out how many pieces of evidence they needed to do this, that and the other. My way of doing it was, because I was teaching in all ability classes as well, was through flexible learning and learner autonomy, which really enabled the learners to kind of develop. But it was very important as a marker that actually languages are for all.
I have a whole host of other questions, but I'm not going to hog the floor, so I'm going to open up now to comments, reflections, memories, practical ideas. While you're thinking about it, then I will ask one other question, but you're on a warning now. What can we learn from elsewhere? I'm thinking about what the devolved administrations are doing. So the Scottish policy of Mother Tongue +2, the Welsh policy of bilingualism +1. Should we be looking towards that kind of thing? Or if we think more generally across Europe, are there policies that we could learn from? The historians have been very good at saying to government, we learn from the past. We as modern linguists have not been good at saying you can learn from looking at other cultures to find out what we do. What could we do in that direction? Could we look at other cultures and systems and benefit from it?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think with one, yes, you can. I think one slight caveat is that the position in languages where the first language is not English is different from those where it is. And some of the issues that we have faced here I'm not necessarily talking about policy, but about performance, take-up, attitude, and so on, are pretty similar in, or even worse, in the States. Australia, I think, is interesting because they did develop. I was there a couple of years ago. They were developing some very interesting ideas of curricula, incorporating also indigenous languages and so on, and a lot of thinking about how do you do that and how you relate different languages to each other. But I certainly think that the European experience, in a broad sense, is worth studying, and there's a very good source of it. You just go online to Council of Europe, you can get about 19 of these,
Yeah.
of different countries.
Yeah.
Some of them better than others, but all of them of some interest. And there's also a kind of, not exactly a summary, but a document written by Mike Byram, which draws together what some of the issues and what some of the themes are. Scotland is interesting because I think they talk a much better talk than we do. I'm not sure of the outcomes are, but that again raises another issue which I could have raised earlier. But if you're thinking about what should a policy be at school in an English-speaking country, one of the big issues you have to take into account is how much time are we going to offer? How much resource are we going to put in? Because I would say now, having been around this track many, many times, that it is virtually impossible to reach a significant level of competence in foreign language without a lot of favourable external circumstances, which clearly favours certain classes over others in most cases, or the validation of languages that are not validated in school. It's impossible to do it on the diet of an hour and a bit a week for a few weeks, then a break, and then another. Nobody would ever put that forward as a model for learning a language. Nobody has ever learnt a language in that way, as far as I know, except for geniuses.
And that's not what they're doing in Catalonia. That's not what they're doing in the Basque Country. It's what, 4 or something hours
We have
a week of primary.
and we're also within the school system, and that was something that came out of the work of the strategy, but we never got very far with it. We need to be looking at intensive modes of delivery. We need to be looking at CLIL much more, and that's all suffering. And CLIL is combining subjects, which is what they do in many in Spain, Catalonia, and so on. But so, and if we're not going to do that, then you have to say, well, what are realistic objectives?
I think interestingly, in the case of Scotland, because of the implementation difficulties, for L3 they are beginning to bring in some of the community languages, perhaps not necessarily ideally in the sense that not necessarily using trained people, but there is that bringing them in, which I think is something that we would all welcome.
Yeah.
And I think in the case of Wales, they are thinking about CLIL in a way that certainly across the rest of the UK, it's not been thought of. And I met somebody from the Spanish embassy who is an expert in CLIL, who was absolutely horrified. I think he'd gone and offered his expertise, around Whitehall and was sent packing, very, very quickly. It was so interesting. Terry, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all it's important to, Lyd mentioned this, that actually if you take English out of the equation, then there's not a huge difference across Europe or other countries, that people are not that, French teachers are losing their jobs, German teachers are losing their jobs. And certainly in some countries, in Sweden for example, English isn't part of the languages curriculum, it's English, and then you've got languages, and therefore when the curriculum changes, then the languages are reduced. I can remember this happening in Norway, but of course English is left untouched. So that and so the issue there is English, which for us is a problem.
Of course.
I said this is a commission meeting a while ago, European Commission meeting, that it's the problem of English, and got shouted at because they said I love English, but I'm talking about the Anglophone hegemony really. And so that is important to bear in mind. I would say then also the other thing that I think is a big problem in terms of policy in this country is that it's used as a political football. So you change the government, and the government needs to change the education system and policies. And I would say partly ideologically driven, but actually sometimes it's not. I wouldn't distinguish it with ideology. I think it's personal whims as well of ministers. And if you look at Finland, there's a consensus on education, which doesn't mean they don't change anything. They've just drastically changed their curriculum and made it much more creative and much more integrated. But that's been going on for some time, and there's an agreement. So you've got that stability, so people can develop and grow, rather than teachers spending their time trying to work out what we're supposed to be doing now. So that would be another thing. And finally, I would say, the coalition government withdrew the UK from membership of the European Centre for Modern Languages, and ECML, which is there in Graz to develop, develop practices around Council of Europe policies, does wonderful work. I mean, I'm still involved but I'm there as an international because of FIPLV, but otherwise the UK is missing out on lots of very interesting work that's going on to look at how one particular piece of work that I'm involved in is looking at plurilingual pedagogies and how we bring the range of languages into the classroom and use them to learn the language of schooling, as they call it, but other languages as well. So,
Okay, thank you. Could you, I don't know whether you could use the microphone. If you press I think you press the button.
All right.
That's
Is
it, perfect.
okay? Yeah, okay, great. So I have a simple question to which the answer might not be so simple, but I was wondering what would be the 3-4 key points of your dream languages policy today in the UK, and what is it that you think that could be actually feasible if the government only wanted?
A languages policy, not separate language policies, which is not that far away. It could be that. Doesn't mean that there wouldn't be English lessons, but it would mean that there would be coherence across language, and language would be seen for what it is, as A, absolutely critical for further education, B, a sign of being a human being, and C, a way of establishing identity and understanding others. So language is central to education, in my view, and that should be reflected in the curriculum. I would like to say getting rid of all assessment, but I would probably not. But I would take that to quite an extreme. Clearly, one needs some kind of objective basis for making some kind of decisions. But there are jurisdictions, Finland being one case, Catalonia being another one, where large amounts of assessment is teacher assessment and even peer assessment, and then you get a university entrance or something at that stage. It's not the high stakes that we have here, which mean, the idea that, sorry, it makes me angry that 7-year-olds are worrying about their position in the SAT is just despicable. That's only 2, isn't it now?
Can I have one now?
Yeah, you can have the third one.
I mean, I would say also, and this was a strong case we made when the Green Paper was out suggesting that languages would no longer be compulsory to 16, and we made a very strong case for languages to be actually a key skill, a key subject right up to 18, but that we would need a range of different types of accreditations and courses and curricula. The government's rationale at that point was that they realised that the stay-on rate post-16 across schools in this country was one of the lowest in so-called developed countries, and therefore wanted to have a coherent 14 to 19 curriculum, which is what we need. And therefore they needed to create more space for a more engaging curriculum for all, and they saw languages as an academic and hard subject. So that was the problem, and we made the case, no, give us languages for all, but also a flexible curriculum and accreditation. So I think that would be a very important one for me, because then we can work at engaging curricula ways in which we, building on things like the diploma types of approaches, really, because we can engage, we can motivate, if we're not having to deal with a kind of straitjacket of a curriculum that is something like, you know, from the 50s or
Yeah.
something, you know,
Yeah.
which is what
Yeah.
we seem to have gone back to.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There's a question here.
Yes, I do think that the benefits of learning languages are advertised enough. I know that, you know, there have been some research published about the importance of languages for in old age, like postponing dementia. Then I worked in the mental health area, both in Ireland and here for a while, and it's actually, if you engage innovative, creative methods, it's very good for your mental health. And then as far as the youth, it's coping skills, it's communication skills. Do you think this could do something in terms of pressure on policies? Or is it something people are just not listening to?
I think the difficulty is who are you talking to? Because yes, those are, I mean, well, I said, even the Leeds report, okay, he was talking about different things. He was talking, that was 1917, talking about the fundamental importance of a foreign language for what he called, I think it was either modern or human studies or something like that. So it was very much a cultural thing. Then other people would have other arguments. So the making the case for languages has almost become a cliche, but who to? Because for 14-year-old kids who are not interested, yeah, we did a lot of that. We did some quite groovy television programs, saying it's all fun and it's great and trendy and you can, you know, live your life in another language was one of the slogans. And it had some effect, but that needs to be long term. I think possibly the critical people are the people who make decisions in schools, head teachers and senior teachers who don't get it, who will say, or used to say, and I'm sure they still do say, yeah, but these kids, they can't speak English properly, so what's the point of doing a language? And that's where you have to be armed with that discussion that you mentioned about communicative competence, literacy, understanding yourself, all that kind of thing. But a lot of it is kind of it's not now. But it's a very interesting question, I think, because I used to go into schools, and I've actually done a correlation between this and Brexit, which is quite interesting, although I wouldn't claim scientific. Schools which were not, we had a policy in 2008 about setting targets for schools to improve uptake post 14, and there were various measures to see how you could count that. And then we did some analysis and went to places where not only were they doing not well in languages, but they were doing worse in languages than in other hard subjects like science. And a lot of those places were places like northern ex-industrial towns, seaports, places in industrial decline. Darlington, and so on. I've got a list of them somewhere. And what the response we got is, well, I say, well, why is it that you can persuade children to do science and not languages? They say, well, you've got to remember there's a steelworks here, or there used to be a steelworks. Science is generally seen by this society as important because it's to do with making things. They don't know what languages are for. Now that was the view.
Yeah.
So it's,
Which, I mean, if I can add something to that, I mean, brings me to the point that I think is important. We can't tell people these things. I mean, you know, it's about experiencing. And when Lyd says they don't know what languages are for, I think that was exactly the difference with the schools that I worked in that were multilingual. Because if you gave them the opportunities to start to learn some of the languages of their friends, then that was a bridge, because they knew, you know, I mean, I did some research. Why have you chosen to do Greek or Turkish and not French or German after these tasters? Because our friends use them and we can practice them and we'll be able to talk to them and others won't understand, or we know what they're saying, or we see them in the shops, we hear them. It was real, and they understood what languages learning was about. And that's why so many of them, I mean, it was unprecedented, chose to do a second foreign language the year after when they were given the option. So in that school, we ended up with a lot doing a community and I'm not just talking about the Greeks doing Greek, you know, but doing one of the community languages plus French or German, yeah, because it acted as a bridge for them in terms of understanding what languages were actually about. It wasn't about jobs or anything. It was about communication. You know,
Well, they always say the best
thing.
reason for learning a language is falling in love with someone who speaks that language,
Yes.
don't they?
Yeah.
Catherine?
We
did-
prescribed that for all.
Yeah.
I was just saying last night, I always say to the students, have an inappropriate love affair and really help you with language. Most of us do.
Does it have to be inappropriate?
I think so many of them are. I think that's got the extra added bit to it. that
Free
makes
song.
it a free song that makes it can be completely appropriate as well. Where am I going with this? I'll shut up before I start confessing everything. Actually, it was about that question, you know, because I think with our projects, with OURI, with our remit to have a transformative effect on modern languages. It's interesting, Terry, that sort of move from languages, modern languages, modern foreign languages, what on earth do we call this? And sometimes it's so sad and heartbreaking to hear these, what has happened over the last 40 years, as well as the great initiatives and the people are continuing to do really fantastic work. We know that, you know. And I suppose it goes back to that question, who cares? And I think we've got to break that somehow. We know that, we talk to amongst ourselves, you know, and there's something there, and I don't know what the answer to this is, but I think it's what we have to get to. This is why I think that the languages memory thing is so important, that we really do gather that information. And of course there's lots of researchers who are doing this. I don't expect you to answer that, and maybe you will, but I think that's such a crucial point. Who really cares? And I do think most people, you do fantastic workshops, and you know about all the work that's being done. And we had the experience yesterday, a group of people, Jim Anderson folk, who are doing the multiliteracies, digital stories. They're going to schools, do wonderful things, really fantastic things. And that's seen by many senior management in schools as a waste of time, because it's not explicitly geared to what the curriculum is doing, although they can prove that it is. There's these sorts of questions, that's one. And the other thing is language itself. And Lid, when you were talking, I felt as if you're going into a sort of Borgesian world, you know, of what is policy, the informal language, when policies don't actually work, when saying it will happen, will not make it happen, and if you don't have a policy, that's actually your policy not to do a thing. Your head just feels as if it's exploding. And I think that sort of sense of language, the language being there to say what will be done, and it doesn't really matter then if it is done or not, I think is really important. When you look at the curriculum for GCSE, and I think particularly for AS and A level, it's really deadening that by this time the student will have done this, so you can tick that box, but it doesn't really matter in the end if the student can or can't do it, because you've got that thing. And I think that's part of me. I don't know how you answer this or you break it, but it's that language.
What's the question?
But it is a language that is there to be void of action somehow.
Yeah.
And
Perhaps
I think anyway that's.
could
my
I just
reflection.
add to that? I suppose you know, I suppose we're troubled as PIs of IRE projects on the weight on our shoulders and what we, you know, how little we might be able to achieve given the state of languages. In terms of this policy and languages memory and the importance of keeping policy questions up in the public domain, what can we as academics do? What are the best mechanisms for us as academics? I went to a thing this week actually at the Institute for Government, which was talking about mechanisms for academics to engage with policymakers and talking about things like the role of chief scientific officers and so on. Of course, we don't have that kind of thing. We, you know, is the idea to have another kind of language czar or a chief government linguist or language officers in the different ministries, because, you know, Baroness Cousin says very well, I think, that languages are everywhere and nowhere in government. You know, that people don't identify the language as part of their portfolio. And then what can we as academics do? Part of it might be recording and keeping this memory of policies alive and pointing out that there were good policies which were either squandered or lost. But what can we do to take this forward, rather than having this rather kind of depressing feeling that it's the same old, and you know, we're seeing yet another report which is saying that languages are a good thing. Yes, we know that it's getting to the people who don't know it that's the problem.
If I just start and give you some time to think about the harder answer, I mean, one of the things that preoccupies me is that after the National Languages Steering Group had finished its work, some of us felt that, you know, that it had been a really good experience to collaborate across different organisations that had some interest in language, but not necessarily languages, organisations, you know, but British Academy, for example, or whatever, or even trade unions, actually, that kind of stuff. And we set up the Language Alliance. Right now, the Language Alliance still exists. It's an informal thing. It has no constitution. We have no funding. But 2 or 3 times a year, people come together to share. And a couple of years ago, we had a meeting, and it was just soul-destroying because there was someone there that hadn't been there before who started to talk about the mess of the transition from primary to secondary and all of that. And it just really brought home the fact that in 2010, all of the research and policy and curricular documents were taken out of public hand. So it was that the websites were taken down. And the Language Alliance decided that we needed to kind of try and collect them again and develop a narrative around them as a resource for people to have a look at how people had addressed the kind of training issue around primaries or the issues around transitions, or, you know, whatever, all of those reports that were going on, as a resource, and to be able to then use as a tool. So I think that's one thing that we do need to do, because otherwise these things will go. You know, the kind of collective memory, the amnesia that I talk about, I mean, it happened too quickly, and I don't quite know why. But that would be one very concrete thing we could do. And then we can decide what we do with all of that. And of course, you can't ever replicate policies, I mean, things, but you can learn from policies, and that's the important thing. And curriculum, and certainly research and those sorts of areas.
And perhaps just to close, Lydia, do you want to say something?
Well, I think your question is a very difficult one to answer. I agree with the part that you mentioned, Terry has said, that definitely needs to be done and promoted and disseminated rather than promoted, so that people know, so that they don't lose. I mean, sometimes I honestly feel this is a fantasy that came into my head, but as I went around the country, I thought, well, this is like, you know, post-Holocaust kind of, you know, the world has been destroyed, but there are people, it's like in Fahrenheit 451, there are people who've somewhere kept a copy of the framework, and they're secretly looking at it and sharing it with people and learning bits by heart. So it's all gone underground, you know, which is not entirely true, of course, because people are doing something quite open. But the conditions are not good. No. The conditions are not good either externally, because a lot of the things we only mentioned very much in passing. But for example, the big push after '92 for languages and the DTI coming in to support languages, the trade and industry, and it was the single market. Well, where's the single market now? You know, you might remember, if you were alive in '90, there were posters all over the place about learning French and German, and this will all be, and everybody was very excited about it. And so those kind of external things, and all of the stuff that happened in the '90s with the Nuffield, there was a generation of idea, and people like Trevor McDonald getting, you know, public figures getting involved and saying, ministers who are interested. I don't know where they are now. So maybe higher education does have a role, which I think it could perhaps be better than it does, because although you think you don't have any clout, probably, your vice chancellors and so on do. So maybe you have to identify some of the key people in higher education who do talk to ministers, who do talk to movers and shakers, and say, look, we have a disaster here, or pending, we've got to do something about it, and it's a long term. So to get that dialogue and that discussion moving, because at the moment I'm sure we are talking to ourselves quite a lot, and I don't detect the government where I work for. There were ministers there who didn't care, but there were some very, very committed. I mean, they had very funny ideas, some of them. But Charles Clarke, for example, was totally committed to languages. I mean, apparently, I'll just have a little anecdote. Alan Moyes, who was the secretary, as it were, for the Nuffield inquiry. They went they had a meeting with him, and Trevor MacDonald and John Boyd and somebody else went to see the new minister, and he said, the first thing I want to say is, I agree with everything you say, which Alan thought was strange because they hadn't said anything yet and they hadn't written anything yet, but he agreed with it anyway. That was how committed they were, but I don't get that sense now. But then there must be people who, because, for example, the APPG, the all-party group, people go, a lot of people go, not many, there's one shadow minister that goes.
There's very few. There's 2 or 3 senior
they're busy
lords
people
that go, but it's, I mean, for those of us who go, we're talking to ourselves. I mean, we're talking to the same old, we're talking to each other, aren't we? I mean, I think it's a fairly depressing experience.
There was some hope at one point that when the British Academy got involved and they were producing this global, and industry was, but it's not really, because the message coming from employers is, put crudely, yes, it's important, but we're not going to pay any more money for it, and that's down to you to sort it out.
I'm very conscious that one of our speakers needs to get across London by 1 o'clock, and it's now 12:30. So I think
I'll give you 5 minutes if you want.
We have 5 minutes then.
Yeah.
That's good. For some, Catherine, I know, has been trying to get in.
No, I just wanted to say, presumably, you're in touch with Nicola McLennan. She's at Nottingham University.
Yeah.
And so all these documents presumably could be put on the website, on the project that she's working on. And my comment was, what do you think about most of the students who are coming in to do modern languages at universities, you know the numbers have dropped horrendously, are from the private sector. And, that I think that needs to be thought about. So they're getting the choice, they're getting the opportunities, and they're getting the world view because they travel, they're used to mixing with other speakers of other languages. So that's becoming a huge gap now.
Although interestingly, I was talking to Nick Mayer from Dulwich College a few weeks ago, who said that the numbers were dropping in Dulwich College as well.
Yeah, I
so
mean,
that's
I went and talked at the
interesting. I don't know if
ISMLA.
it's general or if it was just there.
I
they do a lot.
I did a talk at the ISMLA
Yeah.
conference this year, and I mean the numbers are very,
And-
apart from the top
Yeah.
private schools.
That's because of the assessment system as well.
It
Because
is.
they're not allowed to do 4, they have to do 3. They can't do an AS anymore
No.
as a standalone,
and also,
and they play the game.
and
They say,
languages
what am I going to get
seen
A's
as a
in?
high risk
Yeah,
because it's unpredictable.
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it's, these things are well documented, unfortunately. Okay, so I
We-
think. Sorry.
I mean, just to say also, I mean, back to the earlier question as well, was that we had a lot of support from a really good set of ambassadors in the noughties, didn't they? I mean, they did a huge amount of work supporting language learning, quite high profile. There were editorials in the newspapers and stuff, and they would get together and we would have meetings and stuff. So that's another collaboration maybe that universities can.
But again, I mean,
engage with.
I think we get regular things into the Guardian, but actually what we need, and
Yes,
I'm
the
still
Sun.
bruised from this,
Yeah.
is, you know, we need to be in the Daily Mail. We need to be
Yeah,
in that.
Yeah.
If we're going to change perceptions
Yeah,
generally,
that's right,
that's where we need
absolutely.
to be, and that's a much harder gig
Yeah.
than
And it's interesting that it must be the tide of things, or some kind of sense that they have. I can remember Trevor Kavanagh, pretty right-wing industrial correspondent of The Sun. I think he's still there, a pretty brutal kind of guy. But he wrote an editorial, which I think the quote went something like this, that he was poo-pooing some of the subjects people do in school, but he actually said, well, all you really need is English and maths, but if you have a foreign language as well, then you're made for life, says The Sun.
On that optimistic note, I think we'll draw this session to a close. I've certainly learnt a great deal and found it fascinating. I'm sure you have too. So will you join with me in thanking Terry and Lyd for this wonderful session? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.